The first time I felt something shift, it wasn't Lori's distant tone on the phone or her half-hearted smiles. It wasn't even something she said or did, it was another man's truck parked in front of my house. It was late Friday evening, and I just pulled my rig into the driveway after a week-long haul from St. Louis to Denver. The plan was the usual: shower, dinner, and a long weekend of lazy mornings with Lori. But instead of the warm porch light and the sight of her curled up on the couch, I was greeted by the glow of a taillight from a black Dodge Ram idling across the street. A stranger's truck, its cab dark, the silhouette of the driver barely visible. Now, you've got to understand, I'm not the paranoid type. In my line of work, I've seen my fair share of sketchy characters and learned not to jump to conclusions. But this wasn't a passing car or a neighbor's vehicle. It was parked, pointed right at my house, and something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I killed the engine of my own truck and waited. The driver didn't move. For a minute, I debated marching over and demanding to know what the hell they were doing. But then the truck's engine revved, and it pulled away, its tires crunching the gravel as it disappeared down the street. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my heart thudding in my chest. The logical part of me said I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just someone lost, checking their GPS. But something else, a gut instinct honed from years of life on the road, told me otherwise. It wasn't normal. It didn't feel right. Inside the house, Lori was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand, looking up from her phone with a startled expression. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice a touch too bright, too surprised. I glanced at the clock. "It's past 10, Lori." "Not exactly early." Her cheeks flushed, and she gave a little laugh. "You know what I mean. I wasn't expecting you for another hour or so." I dropped my duffel bag by the door and walked over to kiss her. She turned her face slightly, and my lips brushed her cheek instead. Subtle, but enough to make my stomach tighten. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning back to study her face. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she turned it face down with a practiced motion. "Who was parked out front just now?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. She froze for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, before taking a sip of her wine. "Parked out front? I didn't notice anyone." I frowned. "A black Dodge Ram. Looked like they were watching the house." Her laugh was too quick, too forced. "Lucas, you've been driving for 14 hours. Maybe you're imagining things." Maybe I was. Or maybe she was lying. I shrugged it off for the moment, unwilling to start an argument after being away for a week. But as I unpacked my bag and settled into the quiet of our home, I couldn't shake the image of that truck, or the flicker of unease in Lori's eyes when I mentioned it. By the time I went to bed that night, the fortress of trust I'd built over 12 years was beginning to crack. Saturday morning didn't offer me much comfort. Lori was already up by the time I came downstairs, humming softly as she poured coffee into a mug. She looked up and greeted me with a warm, practiced smile. "You're up early," she said, sliding the mug toward me. "Couldn't sleep," I muttered, taking a sip. I glanced at her, trying to gauge her mood. There was an odd tension in the air, one I couldn't shake. Something about her felt too deliberate, as if she were playing a part she didn't quite believe in. After breakfast, Lori announced that she needed to run errands and left in her car. Normally, this would have been routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. The memory of the black Dodge Ram parked outside our house still gnawed at me, along with Lori's dismissal of it the night before. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before I grabbed my laptop. It didn't take long to find something suspicious. Logging into our shared phone plan, I combed through months of records. A number I didn't recognize popped up over and over, with calls that stretched late into the night and a flood of texts. Whoever it was, they weren't just a casual acquaintance. I copied the number into a reverse lookup tool, and within seconds, a name appeared: Brandon Wright. I didn't know anyone named Brandon, but that didn't mean Lori didn't. I stared at the name, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't nothing. But who was he? I ran a quick search on social media, and a few profiles came up. One stood out: Brandon Wright, a mid-level office manager at a logistics company downtown. His picture showed a man in his early 30s, clean-cut, wearing a button-up shirt with his sleeves rolled. He didn't look like much ordinary, forgettable even, but the fact that his number was all over Lori's phone records made him the most significant person in the world to me at that moment. I needed more. There wasn't enough here to confront Lori, and if I tipped my hand too soon, she might cover her tracks. No, I needed to see things for myself. That afternoon, Lori texted me to say she'd be out a bit longer. I decided to use the time to drive by Brandon's office. It wasn't far, just a 20-minute ride downtown. The building was an unremarkable glass-fronted complex, the kind you'd find in any city. I parked across the street and waited, watching the entrance. People came and went, most of them dressed in business casual. After about half an hour, a man walked out alone, holding a coffee cup and checking his phone. I recognized him immediately from the social media profile, Brandon Wright. He stood by the curb, scrolling through his screen, completely oblivious to my presence. For a moment, I considered walking up to him and asking straight out how he knew Lori. But I stopped myself. Confronting him without evidence would only end badly. I needed to be sure. Instead, I took a photo of him with my phone and jotted down the plate number of the car he climbed into. I'd call Tom later, he'd know how to find more details. When Lori came home that evening, I acted like nothing had happened. She was cheerful, even chatty, as she unpacked groceries and told me about a busy day. I nodded along, hiding my irritation. Every word she said felt like a lie, and I couldn't stand it. But I needed to stay calm, to play along until I had all the pieces. "Do you know anyone named Brandon Wright?" I asked casually as she poured herself a glass of wine. Her hand froze for half a second, then she shrugged. "Brandon? Doesn't ring a bell." "Why?" "No reason," I said, watching her closely. "Just thought the name sounded familiar." She didn't flinch, but something in her eyes shifted, like a flicker of panic she quickly buried. She changed the subject immediately, asking if I wanted to watch a movie later. I agreed, but only to keep her off guard. The next day, I called Tom, my neighbor and a retired cop. I explained the situation, careful not to give away too much. "Think you could help me run a plate number?" I asked. Tom hesitated. "Lucas, you know that's not exactly legal." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important," I said. "I just need to know who this guy is." After a pause, he sighed. "Fine. Give me the details." An hour later, he called back. "Brandon Wright," he said. "Lives in town, works at a logistics firm downtown. No criminal record. Seems like an average guy." I thanked him and hung up, my mind spinning. So Brandon wasn't just a random name, he was someone Lori talked to while I was on the road. Someone she hadn't mentioned once in all the years we'd been together. By now, the evidence was piling up, but it still wasn't enough. I needed to know what Brandon and Lori were to each other before I confronted her. So I made a plan. The following evening, I told Lori I'd be working late on some paperwork. Once she went to bed, I grabbed my keys and drove back to Brandon's office building. I parked a block away, out of sight, and waited. Around 9 p.m., the lights in the building went out, and a few employees trickled out. Then I saw them, Lori and Brandon, walking side by side. They stopped by his car, talking in hushed tones. Lori glanced around nervously before stepping closer. He reached out and touched her arm, and she didn't pull away. My chest tightened as I watched her smile at him, the same smile she used to reserve for me. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, my hands shaking. I didn't need to see more, I had my proof. That night, as I lay awake next to Lori, my mind raced. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the life we'd built, and the lies she'd been telling me. Tomorrow, there would be no more pretending. It was time to confront her. I woke up early the next morning, earlier than Lori for the first time in years. Sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee, I stared at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick by as I planned what I would say. I wasn't a man who liked drama. I never had been. But this? This wasn't something I could let slide. Not after what I saw. When Lori finally came downstairs, still in her robe and rubbing sleep from her eyes, I was waiting for her at the table. I watched her for a moment, trying to decide how to start. She looked so ordinary, so completely unbothered, that it made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I cleared my throat, and she turned to smile at me. "Morning, honey," she said, reaching for 2 mugs. "Coffee?" I ignored the question. "We need to talk." Her hand froze for just a second before she set the mugs down. "Okay," she said, her voice cautious. "What's on your mind? Who is Brandon Wright?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp. Lori's face remained blank for a moment, and then she gave me a faint smile. "Brandon? He's just a friend." "Why?" I pulled out my phone, opened the pictures I'd taken of them, and slid it across the counter toward her. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at the image. Finally, she sighed and pushed the phone back toward me. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Then explain it to me," I said, leaning forward. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear." Lori took a deep breath and folded her arms across her chest. "Lucas, I'm not going to lie to you. Brandon and we've been spending time together. But it's not what you think. There's nothing romantic between us." "Nothing romantic?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You were holding his arm, smiling at him like he's the center of your world. And you expect me to believe there's nothing going on?" "It's not like that," she snapped, her tone defensive. I needed something, okay? Someone to talk to, someone to be close to." I stared at her, disbelief coursing through me. "You needed someone to be close to? And you couldn't come to me? Your husband?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "You're never here, Lucas. You're always on the road, gone for days at a time. Do you have any idea how lonely it gets? How hard it is to feel like I'm just waiting around for scraps of your attention?" "That's no excuse," I said, slamming my hand on the counter. "If you had a problem, you should have talked to me, not run to some other guy." "I didn't run to him," she shot back. "It just happened. I didn't plan it, and I didn't mean for it to hurt you." "Oh, so that makes it okay?" I demanded. "It doesn't matter that you slept with someone else because you didn't mean for it to hurt me?" Lori flinched at the accusation but didn't deny it. "It's not what you think," she said again, her voice softer now. "It wasn't about love or romance. It was just physical." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "You slept with him," I said flatly. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't what you think. It wasn't about him. It was about me. I was lonely, Lucas. I needed to feel wanted, to feel alive." "And you couldn't wait for me to come home?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "You couldn't talk to me, your husband, about what you were feeling?" "You wouldn't understand," she said, shaking her head. "You're gone so much, Lucas. You don't know what it's like to be here alone, night after night, with no one to hold you, no one to talk to." "Don't you dare turn this around on me," I snapped. "I work my ass off to provide for us, to give you this house, this life. And this is how you repay me? By screwing some guy you don't even care about?" Lori's face twisted in frustration. "It's not about repaying you, Lucas. I didn't do this to hurt you. I didn't even think about you when it happened. That hit me like a punch to the gut." "You didn't think about me?" I repeated. "Do you have any idea how that sounds?" She looked down at the counter, her hands gripping the edge. "I know it sounds bad. But I don't see it the way you do. I didn't betray you, Lucas. I didn't fall in love with him. I didn't leave you for him. It was just something I needed." "You didn't betray me?" I said, my voice shaking. You slept with another man, Lori. That's the definition of betrayal. It's not the same, she insisted. It wasn't emotional. It didn't mean anything. I stared at her, feeling a wave of cold fury wash over me. It meant something to me, I said quietly. It meant you broke our vows. It meant you threw away everything we've built together for a moment of feeling alive. Lori looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and guilt. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said. But I don't regret it. Those words hit me harder than anything else she'd said. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. I can't do this, I muttered, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. Lucas, wait, she called after me. We can talk about this. We can work it out. I paused in the doorway, my hand on the knob. I don't think there's anything left to talk about, I said. And then I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for a while after leaving the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Lori's words echoed in my head, cutting deeper the more I replayed them. I don't regret it. How could she say that? After everything we'd been through, everything I sacrificed for her, she didn't even regret it. Eventually, pulling into the parking lot of a roadside bar. The kind of place I'd normally avoid, dimly lit, sticky floors, and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the 90s. But tonight, it felt like the right place to drown out the mess my life had become. The place wasn't busy. A few regulars sat hunched over their drinks at the bar, and a couple was playing darts in the corner. I ordered a whiskey neat and found a spot near the end of the counter, away from everyone else. The first sip burned on the way down, but I welcomed the sensation. It was better than the numbness that had been creeping in since this whole thing started. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into my glass, before someone slid onto the stool next to me. Rough night, a voice asked. I looked up to see a woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail and sharp green eyes that seemed to notice everything. She wore a leather jacket over a tank top and jeans, her posture relaxed but confident. The kind of woman who didn't take crap from anyone. You could say that, I muttered, taking another sip of my drink. Want to talk about it? She asked, motioning to the bartender for a beer. Sometimes it helps. I hesitated, but the alcohol had loosened my tongue. My wife cheated on me, I said flatly. The words felt strange coming out, like they belonged to someone else's life. The woman raised an eyebrow. That's tough. You catch her in the act? Not exactly, I said. But I saw enough to know. And when I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. Said it wasn't a big deal because it didn't mean anything. She let out a low whistle. Damn. That's cold. Yeah, I said, my voice bitter. She actually tried to make it sound like it was my fault. Said I was gone too much because of my job. Like that justifies what she did. The woman took a sip of her beer, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. So, what are you going to do about it? I shrugged. What can I do? She doesn't think she did anything wrong. I walked out before I said or did something I'd regret. She smirked. Maybe you should make her regret it. I frowned. What do you mean? Revenge, she said simply. Let her know what it feels like to be disrespected. Sometimes people need a taste of their own medicine to understand the pain they've caused. I snorted. Sounds satisfying, but I'm not exactly the revenge type. She tilted her head, studying me. Maybe not normally. But this isn't a normal situation, is it? Look, you don't have to go full psycho on her. Just enough to remind her that actions have consequences. Her words stuck with me. I didn't respond right away, finishing my drink instead. The idea of revenge was tempting, but I didn't know if I had it in me. Then again, Lori didn't seem to have a problem tearing apart our marriage for her own selfish needs. Why should I be the one to take the high road? Why are you so interested in my problems? I asked finally. She shrugged. You look like a decent guy who got screwed over. I've been there. Sometimes it helps to have someone in your corner. I nodded slowly, the whiskey blurring the edges of my hesitation. What do you have in mind? By the time we left the bar, it was close to midnight. The woman, Jenna, she'd told me her name was, had a wicked gleam in her eye as she climbed into my truck. The plan was simple: show up at the house, make just enough noise to wake Lori, and let her find us together. No violence, no property damage. Just a loud, unmistakable message that I wasn't going to roll over and take her betrayal lying down. The drive home was quiet, tension thick in the air. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the adrenaline that had me wired, but my hands were steady on the wheel. Jenna didn't say much, just tapped her fingers against her knee in rhythm with the music on the radio. She looked completely at ease, as if this was just another night for her. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a faint glow from the bedroom window. Lori was probably asleep. Good. That would make this all the more satisfying. We slipped inside quietly, Jenna kicking off her boots by the door. Lead the way, she whispered, her grin mischievous. I hesitated for a moment, my conscience wrestling with the plan. But the memory of Lori's indifference to my pain pushed me forward. If she thought what she did was no big deal, she needed a wake-up call. We made our way upstairs, Jenna following close behind. I pushed open the bedroom door, the hinges creaking just enough to rouse Lori. She stirred, her eyes blinking open groggily. Lucas, she mumbled, sitting up. And then she saw Jenna. What the hell is this? Lori shouted, her voice rising with panic. Jenna gave her a little wave. Hey there. Don't mind me. Lori's face twisted with anger and confusion. Who is she? What is she doing here? She's here because I felt like I needed a little company, I said, my voice cold. Since you're so okay with casual arrangements, I figured you wouldn't mind. Jenna chuckled, but the sound only made Lori angrier. Get her out of here, Lucas, she yelled, scrambling out of bed. At that, Jenna smirked. Think I'll let you two work this out. Good luck. She slipped out of the room before Lori could respond, her footsteps retreating down the stairs and out the door. Lori turned back to me, her eyes blazing. What the hell is wrong with you? Bringing some random woman into our home? Into our bedroom? I crossed my arms, meeting her glare. What's wrong with me? Maybe I'm just following your example. Didn't you say it's not a big deal if it doesn't mean anything? That's completely different, she screamed. You did this to hurt me. Exactly, I said, my voice deadly calm. And it looks like it worked. The silence after Jenna left was deafening. Lori stood in the middle of the bedroom, her fists clenched at her sides, her face flushed with fury. She looked at me like I was a stranger, as if I'd just committed the ultimate betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. How could you, she spat, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. In our house? In our bed? I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, keeping my expression blank. I could ask you the same thing, Lori. Only difference is, I didn't lie about it. And I didn't pretend it didn't matter. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. Finally, she let out a frustrated growl. You're acting like a child, Lucas. This isn't the way to handle things. No, I shot back, my voice sharp. The way to handle things would have been to talk to me. To tell me you were lonely, or upset, or whatever excuse you've been telling yourself. Instead, you went behind my back and did God knows what with Brandon. It's not the same, she yelled, her voice cracking. Explain to me how it's different, I said, my tone icy. Go ahead. I'm all ears. Lori glared at me, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to regain control of her emotions. It wasn't about you, she said finally, her voice quieter but no less angry. What I did, what happened with Brandon, it wasn't about us. It wasn't personal. I felt my jaw clench, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Not personal? You cheated on me, Lori. You broke our vows. How is that not personal? She threw her hands up in frustration. Because it wasn't about love. It wasn't about feelings. It was physical, okay? It was a moment of weakness, of loneliness. It didn't mean anything. To you, I said, my voice steady. It didn't mean anything to you. But it meant something to me. It meant you betrayed me, Lori. You threw away everything we've built together for a few moments of, what? Comfort? Excitement? Her expression shifted, the anger fading into something closer to guilt. But she didn't apologize. You don't understand what it's like, Lucas, she said softly. You're gone all the time. Weeks at a stretch. I'm here alone, trying to hold everything together. It's like I'm invisible to you when you're on the road. I shook my head, disbelief flooding through me. And that justifies cheating? That makes it okay to lie to me, to destroy our marriage? I'm not saying it was okay, she snapped, her voice rising again. But it's not like I planned this. It just happened. That's the problem, Lori, I said, stepping closer. You keep acting like this was some kind of accident. Like you just tripped and fell into his bed. But it wasn't. You made a choice. A deliberate choice. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not now. Not after everything. I was lonely, she whispered. I needed someone to be there for me, Lucas. And you weren't. Do you think I like being away from home? I asked, my voice sharp. Do you think I enjoy spending nights in a truck stop, eating crappy food, and sleeping in a cab just so we can afford this house and this life? I did it for us, Lori. For you. I didn't ask you to, she shot back. I never wanted this life, Lucas. I wanted you. But somewhere along the way, I lost you to the job. Her words hit harder than I expected, but they didn't absolve her. You could have told me that, I said quietly. You could have talked to me. But instead, you went behind my back. You lied. And now you're trying to make this my fault. I'm not making it your fault, she cried, the tears spilling over now. I'm trying to explain. I made a mistake, Lucas. A terrible mistake. But it wasn't about you. Then why does it feel like my whole life just fell apart? I asked, my voice breaking for the first time. Lori reached for me, but I stepped back. Lucas. Don't, I said, holding up a hand. Don't touch me. She froze, her hand falling to her side. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything hanging in the air between us. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice muffled. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you can't, I said, my tone hardening again. Maybe some things can't be fixed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lori didn't look up, and I didn't move. Finally, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, smiling, touching, betraying me. I thought about our wedding day, the promises we made to each other, and how easily she'd thrown them away. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I had to do. This marriage, this life we'd built together, it was over. She'd made sure of that. Lori came downstairs the next morning, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say anything, just sat across from me at the table. The tension was unbearable, but I broke the silence first. I'm leaving, I said. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. What? Lucas, no. Please. We can work this out. No, we can't, I interrupted. You made sure of that. Her tears started again, but I didn't feel anything but exhaustion. I'll stay with a friend for now, I said. We'll figure out the rest later. Lucas, please, she begged. I made a mistake. Don't throw away everything because of one mistake. I stood, grabbing my keys. You threw it away, Lori. Not me. And with that, I walked out the door, leaving behind the life we'd built together and the woman who destroyed it. The sun was just starting to rise as I pulled out of town, my rig loaded and ready for a 2-week haul to the West Coast. It was my first time hitting the road since everything with Lori had blown up, and I'd be lying if I said I was eager to leave. But in a way, the open road felt like the only place where I could think clearly. The early hours of the drive were quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. My thoughts were loud, though, bouncing between the anger, the sadness, and the strange, lingering hope that maybe things with Lori weren't entirely over. For all her betrayals, for all the pain she'd caused me, I couldn't deny one thing: I still loved her. It was the kind of love that didn't make sense, the kind you wish you could switch off but can't. Lori wasn't just my wife, she was my partner, my home, the person I'd built my life around. And as much as I wanted to hate her, to erase her from my heart, I knew it wasn't that simple. The first week on the road gave me plenty of time to think. Long stretches of highway have a way of stripping everything down to its simplest form. I thought about what she'd said, that she didn't regret it, that it didn't mean anything. At first, those words felt like daggers, but the more I turned them over in my mind, the more I started to understand. It didn't justify what she'd done, not by a long shot, but maybe it explained it. Lori had been lonely. She'd felt invisible. And while I hated what she'd done to cope, I couldn't ignore my own part in it. I'd been so focused on providing for her, on building a future for us, that I'd forgotten to actually be present in the life we already had. By the time I hit Nevada, I'd made my decision. I would forgive her. Not because she deserved it, but because I couldn't carry the weight of this anger forever. And because, despite everything, I still wanted to make it work. I wasn't ready to give up on the life we'd built together. 2 weeks later, I pulled back into our driveway, my heart pounding as I climbed out of the truck. The house looked the same as always, warm, inviting, the porch light glowing softly in the early evening light. For a moment, I let myself imagine that nothing had changed, that Lori would come out to greet me with a smile, just like she used to. But when I opened the front door, the illusion shattered. The living room was eerily tidy, every surface cleared of the little touches that made the house feel like home. My things were stacked neatly by the door boxes labeled with my name, the handwriting unmistakably Lori's. And then I saw him. Brandon. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter, a beer in his hand. He looked up when I walked in, his expression freezing for a moment before settling into something that looked almost apologetic. "Hey, man," he said, his voice hesitant. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." I didn't respond. My eyes shifted to Lori, who appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She looked at me, her eyes meeting mine for a long, heavy moment. Neither of us spoke, but in that silence, everything was said. She'd made her choice. "Hi," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. "Hi," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at the boxes, then back at her. "Looks like you've been busy." She nodded, guilt flickering across her face. "I thought it might be easier this way." "Easier for who?" I asked, though my tone wasn't accusatory. I didn't have the energy for a fight. Not anymore. Lori looked away, unable to answer. Brandon cleared his throat awkwardly. "Do you need a hand with anything?" he asked, gesturing toward the boxes. I turned to him, my expression cold. "Don't," I said, my voice low but firm. He nodded quickly, stepping back. "Okay. I'll just stay out of the way." I picked up the first box and carried it out to the truck, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't look at either of them as I worked, making trip after trip until the cab was filled with everything that used to be mine. Lori stayed near the doorway, watching silently, while Brandon disappeared into another room. When I finished, I closed the tailgate and leaned against the truck, staring at the house. My house. I'd bought it with my money, spent years fixing it up, turning it into a place where we could build a life together. And now, I was the one leaving. It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. But standing there, staring at the life I was being forced to leave behind, I realized something: I didn't want to fight for it. Not now. Maybe not ever. The house was just a structure. The home I thought I had was already gone. I climbed into the cab and started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the silence. Lori stepped out onto the porch, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't try to stop me, didn't call out or ask me to stay. She just watched as I backed out of the driveway, her figure growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. For a long time, I just drove, my mind blank, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The truck wasn't just my job anymore, it was my home. My refuge. The one place where I didn't have to face the wreckage of my life. As I pulled onto the highway, the horizon stretching out endlessly before me, I felt a strange sense of relief. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how I was going to move forward. But for now, I was moving. And maybe, for the first time in weeks, that was enough.